Art.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. I'm Helen Wood. I'm Professor of Media and Cultural Studies at Lancaster in the Department of Sociology. And what I do is teach and research on media theory, and in particular on television and representational politics. How do I do it? Well, most of my research involves looking closely and carefully at different kinds of media forms, in particular television, in particular their aesthetics, the way they're produced, or the language that's used, and thinking closely about genre and style and not making any assumptions before I've understood that. But I also like to work with audiences and try and think about how people understand television, how they understand the ideas that they're hearing and seeing and reading, and importantly, how that fits and embeds into everyday life. So I guess the how question is a question of methodology, and my methods are really mixed around looking closely at texts, doing textual analysis, thinking about language, thinking about interaction and interactive forms, and thinking about consumption, working with audiences. That means talking to people on the ground, and recording how they think and use different forms of media in their everyday life. And I suppose what I've been really known for is trying to think about how texts work in social contexts in the moment. And so what has often happened more traditionally in media research is either you look at the media or you look at audiences, but rarely do you try and think about how precise moments from media stories or media texts interact with people's lives. And so I'm quite known for developing this methodology called the text in action methodology, which tries to record people talking back to the television, quite literally. It was sort of Gogglebox before Gogglebox, by the way, and to see how they responded to these particular cues, particular moments. So in the research that I undertook with Bev Skeggs, we found these particular responses, particular reactions to forms of reality television that we called judgment shots. And previously we found places where people take part in the conversation of television, respond in particular ways, have particular gasps, particular judgments, which can tell us quite a lot about how it is they're interacting with different particular TV forms. But it could work with other forms, and I have a PhD student who's thinking about how we might think about gaming in a similar way, in a way in which it incites these particular responses and particular moments as they happen. So I'm interested in broadly in discourses, in changes in the way TV or other kinds of media talk about the world. But I'm also interested in the way in which media articulate relationships in the moment, encourage us to react and respond in the moment. And I think that's different, and I think that's got something else to tell us in relationship to these bigger pictures that we tend to take for granted, and we tend to be able to impose them on other stories. And so they're kind of dealing with the detail in some ways can sometimes throw up some challenges and some interesting moments that we might not expect. So you might think, well, what does that have to do with inequalities? And of course, it has a lot to do with inequalities, because one of the bigger questions that I'm interested in is the way in which representational politics means that we have different ways of seeing and understanding people of different class backgrounds, of different gender, different sexualities, different racial politics. We have dominant ways of seeing the world, which we understand through years and years of media analysis. One of the things I'm interested in, though, is the way in which those dominant ways of seeing the world can help reproduce the ways people feel about themselves. So one of the things that we've been interested in, and particularly at Lancaster, are questions like the way in which poverty porn, for instance, which was all across our screens for a particular period in the late 90s and early 2000s, used and articulated working class subjects and participants in reality television as failing and not being able to perform as well in all kinds of aspects of their lives, eating badly, eating unhealthily, not wearing the right clothes, not being good parents, which kind of individualized and blamed them for things that were actually bigger structural problems. And what was interesting to me as a media analyst is the way in which those stories articulated that and gave you a way of seeing from which you could position yourself as morally superior. And one of the questions that Bev, Skeggs and I were looked at in the project Reacting to Reality Television was to try and think about that, the way that positioned the audience to feel themselves in similar ways. And to really, I guess the big question of that research was to think about how divisive is this kind of programming when we actually want a less divisive society. So I guess, you know, my bigger aim is to think about how television, you know, and how its potential is could be about building communities rather than dividing communities. As an art form, I think of television as having huge potential, and I hold on to that quite unusually, perhaps for some media analysts. So we undertook research with different kinds of audiences, and what we found in that project, which was funded by the ESRC, is that what reality TV invited you to do, not just the kinds of things it said, which other people were talking about, but what it invited audiences to do was to situate themselves within lots of different value struggles, lots of different what we call tournaments of value, which we found is problematic. It's inviting people to constantly measure themselves, to constantly analyse themselves, and to constantly see themselves as perhaps failing or succeeding in some areas rather than others. And of course, this deflects attention away from the very social elements that create and reproduce inequalities. So I've been interested in that kind of representational politics, and what that's led me to more recently has been to think about that as a space. So one of the things that's happened in the last 10 or 20 years or so across television, of course, is that more and more ordinary people have been invited into the frame. And this is for a number of reasons. It's cheap, largely. Second reason, it's largely cheap. But also because the technology enables us to edit quickly, easily, freely. So we can shoot lots and lots of film. This makes production cheap, but it also makes the production of programmes quick and easy to do in relative ways. So what we've done is invite ordinary people into the frame and edit them in particular ways. And so I'm interested in that as a process. So there are technical processes that are involved in reproducing inequalities that are part of the way in which the industry and the way in which the institutions work. So I'm interested in that as a process. But then I'm also interested in who these people are. And these people tend to be people we care less and less about, I think, or we've increasingly cared less and less about. So if you think of a programme like Love Island, a lot of people have wondered, why do we care about those people who've stepped into the frame? These are, and have sometimes been described as vacuous, people who are influencers, who are fake anyway, who want this kind of media career. But we've rarely thought about the process in which that has happened. So what's happened is there's been a space opened up where ordinary people, not thought about as workers, not represented by equity, not having any protections, are trying to get a space in the media limelight and in which TV production companies can use and move and shift about in ways in which they want, because these are a resource that are entirely unprotected. And you might think, why should we protect them? But of course, we haven't thought enough about it because we haven't really thought about how to regulate and think about this space. So some of the more recent work I've been doing has been to work with the recent parliamentary inquiry with the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. And what they were interested in were the ways in which certain forms of reality television could use relatively exploitative practices without much oversight. And you may have seen that the very famous Jeremy Kyle show was pulled, and Love Island come under question, partly because of the the impact that stepping into the media limelight had on people's lives, and partly because of the social media attention that ensued afterwards. And part of my role on that inquiry was to look at the evidence coming in from participants, coming in from TV production companies, coming in from audiences, which talked a lot about the ways in which people had no idea what they were doing. They didn't have managers. They were signing contracts without looking at them. And the ways in which the shows use relatively manipulative practices to get the drama, to get the effect. So what I've been interested in is in this interplay between the dramatic production and real people's lives. And I think we lost sight of the fact that there was a kind of manipulation of real people's lives without any oversight. Now, anybody doing research in a university or in a medical field or anywhere, if they want to use real people, have to think about the ethics of doing that. And yet we created a space in which, or a space evolved in which, the ethics of ordinary people wasn't brought into account. And these ordinary people have been those people who don't have access to traditional media careers, who don't have representation, but for whom, with access, you might argue, with less access to other kinds of resources or less access to other kinds of social mobility through careers or apprenticeships or whatever, find this particularly appealing. And other research which has looked at young people and how they think of their lives has talked about the ways in which they see media careers as a really, really reasonable option these days. It's on their agenda. And increasingly those spaces, and I've become more and more interested in this, have shifted. It's not just television that allows entry into that. It's YouTube, it's Instagram. Most of the stars of Love Island have been selected from their Instagram profile. And there's a very intense working relationship between the way in which people work on their bodies, provide, do things to get themselves into the media limelight, which is really, to me, really interesting. And again, relatively unregulated or unthought about. So I'm interested in how different platforms open up to create spaces. And then when platforms open up, what ways in which do they embed existing forms of inequalities, but also engender and create new forms of inequalities? Because, of course, even if you talk to somebody from equity, they will tell you that the person is most vulnerable at the point at which they're trying to enter into a media career. We've seen that with Harvey Weinstein. You are most vulnerable if you are at the point at which you need something from a platform or from an institution. And yet, because these are not thought of as actors or not thought of, this new category of influencers don't have any kind of professional regulations around them, what's opening up are a host of different kind of talent managers, management bodies that move, that shift, and that try and work the relations of these bodies and these people and attach them to brands, programs, etc. So I guess to wrap it up, I'm increasingly interested in not only representational politics, what we see, what are the problems with what we see, and why aren't there enough different versions of different kinds of working class subjectivities available. But I'm also interested broader in the production process, how forms and platforms of production are opening up, and who has access to what kinds of forms of storytelling. You know, the fact that there are less and less working class people working in the traditional creative industries alongside this opening up of these alternative spaces means I think we need to think about who gets to tell what kind of story in what kind of way and what effect does that have on them. So that's my broad interest in the media and inequalities.